BioCentury This Week is brought to you by RemeGen Co. RemeGen is a leading biopharmaceutical company in China committed to discovering, developing, and commercializing innovative biologic drugs to address unmet medical needs in patients with autoimmune and ophthalmic diseases and cancer. RemeGen's flagship drug, telitacicept, is a first-in-class BLyS-APRIL dual targeting fusion protein drug that has been launched in China for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and is in late-stage development for various autoimmune diseases, such as myasthenia gravis, IgA nephropathy, and primary Sjogren's syndrome. RemeGen has research labs and offices across China and the United States.
FDA's plan to move away from animal toxicology testing brings the agency a step closer to an important, long-standing goal. We take a closer look at the first major announcement of plans to modernize FDA by new Commissioner Marty Makary on the BioCentury This Week podcast. We'll also discuss Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and FDA, including remarks by the HHS Secretary that have intensified the morale crisis at FDA. We'll also take a peek at how the biotech indices have been reacting to all of this. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on BioCentury This Week are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of BioPharma Intelligence.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Hey, you've probably already heard about our BioEquity Europe conference. That's BioCentury's flagship conference in its 25th year this May in Belgium. But did you know about our Grand Rounds conference, which sits at the nexus of academia and industry, and will be in Chicago just after ASCO, and then we'll be debuting a second Grand Round conference in the UK this September. You can learn more on our website, and we'll also have a little bit of a mid-roll break halfway through the podcast today so you can learn a bit more about it. And now this, FDA Commissioner Marty Makary has unveiled plans to replace animal models with alternative methods. Lauren, this has been a goal for FDA for some time now for several reasons. What's the backstory?
Yeah, so I think this has obviously been on the table for a long time. Lots of people want animal models to be reduced in clinical research, both for the animal rights and to benefit companies and patients. Animal models can be expensive. They can be time consuming to get results, after having to wait for these animals to develop when you treat them with drugs or knock out genes. There's also the fact that as therapies, mAbs in particular, are getting more specific and selective for human targets, especially in this world where everything has an immunology component, animal models are becoming less predictive. Even in toxicity, what you see from a humanized mAb in a mouse model or in a non-human primate may not be predictive of what you're going to see when you take that drug into patients, with both false positive and false negative signals. If you treat a monkey with an antibody that's a human antibody, you may get an immune response that you won't get in an antibody. That may prevent that drug from ultimately making it into humans. You may not see toxicity signals in an animal that you could see in humans. So this has been something that's been on the table for a long time. Over the past 3 years, it's become more of a reality ever since the FDA Modernization Act 2.0, which authorized the use of non-animal alternatives to support INDs and also remove some of the requirements for animal use studies. Yeah, it's something that's been in the works. And I think what we see here with the roadmap that was outlined last week is that this is a plan to actually have the animal studies, in some cases, start to be replaced rather than just supplemented with some of these new alternative methods, which include organ on a chip, some newer iterations of the organ on a chip idea, like different human tissue models, and AI-based in silico models.
Like you said, it's something that's been in the works for a long time. It's obviously a good idea. It's an idea that people can get behind. But the headlines, that came out basically would lead people to think, that's it. The rats can go home. They're safe. They're not going to be needed anymore. That's not really the case, is it?
Oh, definitely not. I think this is a stepwise thing. We're already seeing these alternative models being used in INDs based on what some of the, companies developing the technology are telling us and some of the companies that are using that technology. So this type of research is already supporting drug applications. Animal models are very important for many different reasons. And also some of these new technologies aren't completely validated. We need to line up the animal data, the data from the new non-animal models, and the clinical toxicity data. A lot of this roadmap is about gathering that data and actually validating these models. And this is something that will take years to start replacing some of these animal models in some different therapeutic settings. They're starting with antibodies. Ultimately, I think the plan is to move to other biologics and maybe eventually to small molecules as well. But I don't think that this is something that's going to change things overnight.
Can you maybe give us an example of a low-hanging fruit here? Is there some assay that could already be in the tox package that could be swapped out for a non-animal one?
So I've been hearing that there are some cases where alternative methods are already being used to replace animal studies and are already being requested by FDA. One of those is whole blood in vitro assays as a way to predict cytokine storm. The ability to use blood from lots and lots of different patients and test the effects of the therapy and the ability to induce that inflammatory reaction in the blood is more useful than what you would get by treating a mouse or a non-human primate, getting that diversity from humans. So that's something that's already working into IND packages. And there are some other examples like that.
So just one more question on this, Lauren. Do you expect companies to significantly change their processes based on this announcement? I'm understanding this is something that's going to take a long time. I think companies are already trying to explore using predictive models and so on, really just trying to get a handle on what kind of an impact you think this is going to have in any reasonable term.
So I spoke with the co-founder and CEO of a company called Vividyne. He said, and this is a company that's creating some of these alternative models. And what he said is that companies like his are already partnering with biopharma companies. They're using these technologies, whether or not that's making it into INDs. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. What he thinks will happen as a result of this roadmap and the guidance that will come out is that more of the data that companies are already gathering will actually make it into the IND process, will be compiled so that these technologies can become more validated and at some point can be used in place of animal testing. So I think that makes sense. I think that, we'll just see more of this data in IND packages.
Yeah, and I know that initially some of the preclinical CRO stocks did take a hit on this. I imagine that's something that, is going to play out over time. I don't think, as you pointed out, Steve, they're going to be out of business overnight. And I'm sure they've probably got strategies to deal with this, but that's something we'll continue to watch.
All right. Well, look for Lauren's story on biocentury.com. And we will turn to RFK Jr. and his remarks to the FDA staff on Friday after this.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
Okay, we are back. Let's turn to Washington. HHS Secretary RFK Jr. dismayed agency employees further when he accused FDA of being corrupt in a speech riddled with conspiracy theories that referred to staffers as, quote, sock puppets, unquote. Steve, where to begin?
Well, yeah, look, the speech was disjointed, and at first it's kind of hard to connect the dots. He said that capitalism inevitably devolves into authoritarianism, that churches also become corrupted, and that the deep state, that's the notion that there's a secret cabal inside government seeking to undermine democratically elected leaders, that the deep state is real, and he talked about MK Ultra. And really, I never thought I'd hear an HHS secretary use a CIA cryptonym in a speech to FDA. And it happens I have studied MK Ultra. It was a wide-ranging CIA program that started in the 1950s involving unethical, actually criminal experiments on unwitting Americans. Kennedy falsely said that the FDA was involved in MK Ultra. It wasn't. And then he talked about Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. Those were in 1961 and 1963. And he falsely said they were funded by the CIA. Anyway, what in the world does all this have to do with the FDA in 2025? Well, he also said FDA has been subverted by industry, and he cited Fast Track as an example of industry capture. He said industry has prevented FDA from approving alternative medicines, and he told FDA employees, quote, if your boss is making a mistake, if they're approving something that shouldn't be approved, we want to hear, end quote. And he concluded his remarks about the Milgram experiments by admonishing FDA staff to resist unethical instructions. So the whole point of this seemed to be that he believes that some FDA employees are part of the deep state, something that President Trump said in his first term, and that agency staff should inform on and defy the orders of their superiors. And when you think about it, and you take out all the kind of drama around the things that he said that you really don't expect an HHS secretary to be talking about, it's an extraordinary underlying message from the head of a government department to basically say to the employees there, you know, I'm calling on you to inform on your superiors when they're trying to approve drugs that you think shouldn't be approved, and that you should defy instructions that you believe are unethical. You know, that's quite extraordinary. Oh, and one thing I would say also is that he repeated, RFK repeated something he talks about a lot about how much healthier Americans were back in the day, back when he was a kid. So I looked up some of the numbers, you know. Average life expectancy for someone born in the United States in 1965 was 70 years. Today it's 79. In 1965, infant mortality rate was 23.3 deaths per 1,000 live births. In 2022, it was 5. And a lot of the improvements in the health of Americans, the reductions in infant mortality and the extensions in life can be attributed to the drugs that FDA and the therapies that FDA helped to get across the finish line.
So, Steve, you know, people that I've been speaking to are saying a number of things, as I'm sure they are to you, that probably shouldn't be on this podcast. But some of them are things like, what is Cassidy doing? And the real question, I think, for people is, where does this go? Is there an end? You know, is there really no reining in of somebody who's causing really quite a lot of harm to an agency and thereby to public health, as we know, through the measles outbreaks and so on, which have probably caught more of the public eye than the FDA business? So what do you think about that?
Well, look, I think that there's only one person who Kennedy has to keep on his side in order for him to stay in office, and that's Donald Trump. I don't think that Senator Cassidy has much influence over Kennedy at this point. Traditionally, the influence that Congress would have over an agency head or department head would be that if that department head did things that the Congress didn't like, that they would cut the budget. But in this administration, that's exactly what they want to have happen, you know, so that kind of dulls that knife, right? I think the other thing to think about is where's Marty Makary, the commissioner of the FDA, and all of this? You know, he made introductory remarks to Kennedy at this speech at FDA. He repeated the Make America Healthy Again slogan. What he didn't say was how many FDA staff have been fired or had their positions terminated in layoffs, why those things happen, what's the plan for making the agency function well with a quarter of its staff gone. And, you know, that's the thing. I think that at some point, Marty Makary, the FDA commissioner, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the HHS secretary, they have to show the receipts. You know, they have to say, what has happened so far? Why has it happened? What are the effects of it? And I think they also have to show that they're aware of the possibility that FDA could inadvertently trigger provisions in the law that would make it impossible to collect user fees, and that they're taking steps to make sure that that doesn't happen. I should say that McCary is taking some steps to keep FDA functioning. He's quietly allowed some staff who were teleworking before COVID to resume teleworking. And there are reports that he's hiring contractors to do some of the jobs of administrative staff who've been fired. It's kind of hard to see how that's efficient, since the contractors are going to have to be trained to do the jobs that FDA staff are doing perfectly well. And it's quite likely that they're going to be paid more than FDA staff were. But it will allow the administration to say that they've reduced headcount, and that seems to be one of the priorities here.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm hearing that in other agencies as well. You know, you and I both live in DC. There's a lot of other agencies where they're letting people go and then hiring either them or other people back as contractors. But that's all anecdotal, of course. Steve, I think not everybody really understands how the PDUFA negotiations work. Maybe just walk through what that looks like in normal times and the timeline and what we should be expecting this year. As I hope many of you know, we did run a survey in the last few days, a risk sentiment survey. We will be publishing that week. I can tell you that generally people are very concerned. And one of the issues that has come up is the PDUFA negotiation. So walk us through how that works and what you think is actually going to happen.
Okay, so there's two sets of issues. One is keeping PDUFA going today and tomorrow and next week and next year. And the other is the new PDUFA negotiation, okay? So on the first one, the law was created, it was not intended to substitute for congressional appropriations. It was intended to supplement them. And in order to make sure that that happened, what Congress did is it put triggers in the law. And it said that if FDA doesn't take certain actions, if they don't have certain staffing levels or certain levels of expenditure, then user fees, they won't be able to collect user fees. Either they'll have to reduce the amount of user fees they collect, or they won't be able to collect them at all. There are people who, former FDA staff, who are quite concerned that FDA could inadvertently stumble into a situation now where it would no longer be able to collect user fees. That's one set of problems. Then there's the other issue, which is reauthorization of user fees. Normally, the discussions, the formal kind of negotiations for renegotiating PDUFA fees and fees on devices and generic drugs and other products would start sometime, late spring, early summer this year. And then the year after, there would be some kind of an agreement would be submitted to Congress. There's a concern that that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen in a timely way. There have been comments from Kennedy and from others in the administration, others in the White House, that they don't believe in user fees, that they think that user fees are a form of corruption. And the concern is that if the user fees aren't reauthorized, then something else has to be put in place that will allow industry to provide funds that are dedicated to FDA so that it can do its job. Or Congress has to step up and replace those funds. In this environment, it's very difficult to imagine Congress doing that. There's nobody that's going around Washington talking about how can we spend more money on government these days. So there you have it. And I think you also have to, realize that the White House, Kennedy, others are going to realize that reauthorizing user fees or replacing them with something else that has the same or a similar effect is of tremendous importance to the biopharmaceutical industry, because if it doesn't happen, really drug reviews will really slow to a crawl. That provides a tremendous opportunity for brinksmanship. It gives the administration leverage over industry to try to get concessions in other areas. We don't know what those would be. In the past, you would say, well, something like that can't really happen. How can you endanger the public health? How can you endanger an industry like that with those kinds of threats? But those are precisely the kinds of things that we've seen in other spheres that the Trump administration has done. So it's certainly not out of the question.
Steve, how are things at NIH?
Grim. Things are really grim over there. I wrote a story, I think it was last week, pointing out some of the problems. Look, you've got by my last count, 6 institute directors who have been pushed out since the beginning of the Trump administration. You've got hundreds of scientists and thousands of employees overall who have been pushed out, either been laid off or fired. And the grants to a number of elite institutions have been frozen over policies that have nothing to do with biomedical research funding. And the pushing out the staff, some of the RIFs, the reduction in force notices, went to staff who are responsible for maintaining contracts and for also keeping the flow of grant money going to academic institutions. And what people at NIH have told me is that losing that specialized knowledge about how federal contracting works and the intersection of federal contracting and biomedical research, losing that expertise puts a lot at risk because it may become difficult or even impossible in some cases to issue contracts, to make grant money flow out the way that it's supposed to. So in addition to all of the deliberate cuts that have been made, you could have inadvertent cuts that would also make it difficult or impossible to continue doing science in the United States in some fields.
And have we seen bulk of the cuts we're going to see, or is there more coming?
I think it's quite likely that we're going to see more coming, and we're going to see more changes both at FDA and at NIH, because the layoffs that we saw already, that was phase one. There's supposed to be a phase two, which is supposed to have even bigger layoffs. It's also supposed to include reorganization and sending some functions that are being performed in high rent areas like the Washington, D.C. area to other areas of the United States. So dispersing some things from Washington to other places, which would be highly disruptive. What we've heard about changes at FDA, there's a plan, or I would say an outline of a plan that's been floating around Capitol Hill. And I'm told that it's actually serious. This is what HHS is really thinking about doing for reorganizing FDA, where they would put all of the review functions for everything, for drugs, for biologics, for devices, for tobacco, for food, for cosmetics. All those review functions will be put in one center. All the inspection functions for those activities would be put in another center. And people who I've spoken with who have been responsible for designing and implementing organizational changes at FDA in the past have said that this is likely to be completely unworkable. And it really goes against the grain of everything that they've been trying to do to make things more efficient for a few decades, but also that there's a lack of managers at FDA now who could make this happen effectively. At NIH, there's going to be even bigger changes that are in the works. There's discussion of eliminating institutes, of reorganizing institutes. And that in itself probably definitely isn't an unreasonable thing to do. But really the question is whether it's going to be done, one, whether it's really being done with the intention to improve biomedical science in the United States, and two, whether there's a competency there to do it, whether it's being done in a thoughtful way that will actually advance science, or whether it will result in a great deal of chaos and erode the ability of NIH to conduct and fund biomedical research in the United States.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things, because I also met with different people at NIH in social settings. Shout out to the host of my Passover Seder, indeed. So, there have been various conversations, but one thing that I'm hearing is, there are some labs that the contracting issue is huge. Everything is done by contracts. There are labs that it basically means you can't order new reagents. There are labs that are sort of weeks away from reaching the point where they just can't do experiments. So they're like, what are we going to do? We're going to come to work, we're being paid, and we can't do our experiments. I think there's going to be a lot of review papers that are written in the next few months, because that's what you do when you can't do experiments. But, there's that. This is actually aside from various immigration issues related to this. And Steve, regarding your point about restructuring NIH, everybody that I've spoken to, this may be the same for you, at NIH, would actually agree that NIH could sorely use some restructuring. Most of them say there's 50 ideas around this table or in this room for how that could be done. So there's no dearth of ways to do it. But as you point out, whether what ends up being done is done in a deliberative, thoughtful, and basically productive manner is important. And one more thing is, people at NIH, we talk a lot about China, we talk a lot about the biomedical competition from China, this is something academics are acutely aware of. And, their question really is whether, much as the US actually ceded ground on semiconductors and so on, whether the prospect of that happening in biomedical science is something that could sway this administration to think differently. I don't know what your thoughts about that, but that is something that, they're all sitting there looking at the potential for China, which is one thing, but the demise in the US is another.
Well, it's already happening. I mean, we are giving China a competitive advantage in biomedical research and in the life sciences by eroding the ability of the United States to conduct research. Whether the administration will see it that way is really another issue. And I think that we talked about this last year in the context of the Biosecure Act. There are kind of two camps that are looking at this. One camp is a national security camp, and the other camp is a life sciences camp. The national security camp, the first thing that they reach for is the idea that you can erode China's capabilities, that you can slow them down. That's really what they emphasize. And of course, people who are in the life sciences, one, realize that that's probably not practical. It probably couldn't be done, even if it should be done. And they emphasize the need to bolster American life sciences, right? And bolster competitiveness in the American life sciences. And that runs into the chainsaw of the Doge, right? It runs into the chainsaw of people who want to eliminate government spending and who want to eliminate government competency and capabilities in favor, they believe, of the private sector. So I don't have a lot of confidence that that there's a light that's going to go off in the White House and they're going to say, look, we're losing out to China and we're making things worse by damaging American life sciences research capabilities. I agree that should be. That's what should happen. That's the message that should come across. But I don't see that it is happening.
Well, maybe we can end on an optimistic note by circling back to where we started in this discussion, which is FDA trying to accelerate the phasing out of costly and time-consuming animal studies for tox packages, because one of the big areas where there's been a lot of criticism of FDA is how long it takes companies to get clinical trials started in the first place. And there's been plenty of companies telling us, hey, we're just taking our phase 1 trials elsewhere. If this new initiative can move the needle on that, that might be a little ray of hope.
It's definitely it's definitely a step in the right direction, and you can't, I wouldn't argue with that. Whether it's of the magnitude that can offset the other things that I've been talking about, is extraordinary.
Well, by itself, it certainly wouldn't. Yeah.
And we're going to be writing more about the issue of starting clinical trials faster in China very soon.
And we're also going to be writing this week about concerns that the biopharma space has, not only about FDA, but also about NIH, right?
Absolutely. That is part of our survey. We will be providing that data. We got a tremendous response. So keep an eye out for that very, very key biotech risk sentiment survey. Jeff, talking about risk and biotech, you had an interesting week to take off. We all noticed that you chose to take off, what is it, Liberation Week or Tariff Week or Turnaround Week or Eating Your Words Week? Go ahead and tell us what you were doing while we were all whipsawed.
I had a lovely time. I was exploring opportunities for my home state of California to return to its maybe its Mexican roots, or perhaps relaunch as an independent republic. San Diego's quite lovely. A little kayaking among the sharks down there, and catching up with the Los Angeles Dodgers for Freddie Freeman bobblehead night.
Kayaking among the sharks sounds like some kind of a metaphor for trying to understand what's happening with the markets these days.
It's a good point. Yeah, at first, our fearless tour guide just said leopard sharks, they're harmless. And then he let people go for a swim, including my 11-year-old daughter. And then he mentioned how great whites like to come to the La Jolla Cove. And it was good. It's good. He really put at risk his tip with that one. But anyway, Lovely time. Got to see, the Salk Institute and UCSD. Yeah, it was good stuff. Good stuff. But yes, coming back, I did read your story, Steve, while I was out, and it started bringing some of the tension back into my life. And of course, everything that you wrote about there, plus the tariff not so merry-go-round, led to a white knuckle week for biopharma indices while I was away last week. We all know that the markets went into a precipitous decline in early April after the tariff announcement. Last week, biopharmas slumped further after President Trump said pharmaceuticals would be subject to tariffs specific to the industry. Then, of course, the 90-day pause. It's a little bit of a bouncing ball to follow, as we all know. Lifted up biopharmas only for them to continue to sort of oscillate wildly ever since. And fans of the XBI know all too well that the days of it breaking 100 are very far in the rearview mirror. We're now in the mid 70s, down double digits on the year. What are you hearing from folks, Simone?
Yeah, so, just to make this clear, since March the 28th, not only has the XBI gone down, but it has underperformed the market. And this is a recurring theme as we look at the compound effect. I don't know if it's additive or even more than additive, super additive, but we have the general macro market turmoil. And then on top of that, we have the regulatory risk, an order of magnitude that we just haven't seen for decades, which we've talked about before on this podcast. So that trend continues. Selena, I think like almost every day yesterday, we issued a stock chart, just watching it go.
We did.
With this whipsaw. But I think there are a few other things we're hearing that you should stay tuned to us. We have our feelers out. There are crossover investors who are starting to get the heat. I think a lot of industries are having this, margin calls and so on. My colleague, Stephen Hansen, wrote a perspective on Friday saying the sky is not falling, but note he did put yet in that title. So I think there's a lot of nervousness there. I don't know that we are talking about major VCs going out of business.
That's what he was trying to push back on in that perspective. There's the rumors flying around that maybe some bigger firms are facing an existential threat, which there's lots of reasons to think they aren't. The way that they structure themselves can't allow for that to happen quite so quickly. Smaller firms, on the other hand, could be facing existential threats if things don't change quickly.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just because those bigger firms aren't facing existential threat doesn't mean they're not massively under pressure. And of course, for all of the biotechs who are out there and innovators who are out there trying to raise money, that just makes it extra hard. When your VCs are under pressure, that's not a good thing for you. So these are troubled times. We do continue, of course, to emphasize that innovation marches along, Selena. We've still got lots and lots of really innovative, exciting things we've been writing about. Just tell us a couple of the cool sciencey things that we've been writing about, just so that we can...
Check out our story. Check out our story on base editors. Our colleague Danielle Gullivan, our preclinical team scans, I think it's 27. I forget exactly how. Like a lot of journals, picking out just the most translationally relevant studies, and they collect them up and look for trends over time. And so she's got a year's worth of studies on base editor advancements, and that's a very cool study. I mean, the field is it's evolved beyond finding new base editor systems to just engineering ways to actually make them more useful for therapeutic applications. A lot of that innovation is around efficiency, and a lot of it's coming out of China.
And she had a great story on exosomes a couple weeks back, right, Selena?
She did. Simone, you edited that one.
I did indeed. And I really recommend everyone check that out. For people who don't know that much about exosomes, this is a sort of evolving field. These are small vesicles that pinch off of various different cells, and companies are increasingly working out how to use them in therapeutic applications. And so the field sort of has as many, I think we do call this a new modality, Selena, right? As many of these new modalities do, there are sort of some teething problems. We had a couple of companies, Kodiak is one, that sort of went out of business, but actually they did move the field along. And there are a lot of issues around manufacturing them and measuring them. So this is a very new technology. I personally feel, Steve, despite the idea that health isn't as good as it used to be in the 60s or whatever, innovation actually not only has health got better, but I believe that innovation gets faster. And I believe that our ability to iterate on these new kind of modalities is faster. It took monoclonal antibodies a very long time. It's taken, let's say, nucleic acids, so oligonucleotides, a very long time, siRNA and so on. We'll see if something really innovative like exosomes, which is a fairly new field, has to go through another 10 or 15-year period before it reaches product on the market, or whether the kinds of things that are happening can benefit orthogonally and really move that ahead. So that's Danielle's story that Jeff is going to put in the show notes, right?
Oh yeah, we'll do. Yeah, we keep meaning to talk about it on the podcast. I'm glad we finally did, but there's something going on in Washington that keeps occupying a bit of our time here. Well, alrighty. Thank you for tuning in, Selena, Lauren, Steve, and Simone. Thanks as always. A shout out to our production guru, Cole Travis, up in the PNW. And we will catch you next week on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank RemeGen for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about RemeGen's products and pipelines, you can go to www.remegen.com.